The tavern fell silent the moment he laughed. A deep, cruel sound that echoed off the iron walls of the outpost, slicing through the hum of alien voices and clattering mugs. The human mercenary, scarred and half-drunk, raised his glass toward the quiet girl in the corner, blue-skinned, shy, and trembling. "Didn't know beauty standards dropped this low in your world," he sneered. Then the light dimmed. A shadow loomed behind her, massive, armored, and breathing like a forge. Forearms flexed, each gripping a weapon. The warrior's eyes burned crimson. "You mock my daughter, human," he growled. "Then you mock me." The tavern's walls groaned under the pressure of laughter, conversation, and the hum of cheap engines running outside in the dust-choked night. It was a place built for people who wanted to forget: smugglers, soldiers, deserters, scavengers. The air reeked of oil, sweat, and fermented grain from a dozen worlds. Cale sat at a corner table, one boot resting on the metal rung, the other tapping the floor in a rhythm only he seemed to hear. His coat was old, the kind that carried the smell of rain from planets that no longer had it. A half-empty glass sat before him, and next to it, the barrel of his blaster gleamed under the yellow light. He wasn't there for trouble. Not tonight. He told himself that as he watched the holographic jukebox flicker between songs, human voices blending with alien tongues. But trouble had a way of finding him, especially when he'd had just enough to drink to forget the weight of his past. That's when she walked in, small, graceful, and utterly out of place. Her skin shimmered faintly under the light, like the surface of a calm ocean. 4 delicate ridges curved along the sides of her face, marking her as one of the Karen. She wore a simple wrap of woven silver fibers, her posture modest, her eyes lowered. And when someone at the bar barked a crude comment in her direction, she didn't answer. She just bowed her head slightly and kept walking, a tray of drinks balanced in her trembling hands. Cale didn't mean to laugh. Not really. It slipped out, low, bitter, and self-loathing. "Didn't know beauty standards dropped this low in your world," he said, words sharp enough to cut through the murmuring crowd. The sound hit her like a physical blow. Her step faltered, the tray nearly tilting. The laughter died instantly. Silence spread, heavy and cold, swallowing the tavern whole. Even the engines outside seemed to fade into it. The girl's eyes lifted slowly, huge, luminous, and filled with something between hurt and disbelief. For a heartbeat, Kyle saw something familiar in them, something he couldn't face, and that made it worse. So he forced another laugh, louder this time, trying to bury the guilt that rose like bile. "Didn't mean to offend," he muttered, though his tone said otherwise. "Just making an observation." The bartender, an old cyborg with one glowing eye, took a cautious step back. "You best stop talking, human," he warned softly. Cale frowned. "What, she your niece or something?" Then came the sound, a low, metallic growl, deep enough to rattle the glass on the tables. The lights flickered once, twice. A shadow moved behind the girl, vast and impossible. When he turned, he saw him. The figure that filled the doorway was like a mountain carved from living steel. Nearly 8 feet tall, shoulders as broad as a shuttle wing, skin the color of dark iron. 4 arms hung at his sides, each one corded with muscle, veins glowing faintly beneath the surface, like molten veins of ore. His armor wasn't ceremonial. It was battered, scorched, and scarred by wars that would have killed lesser beings. And his eyes, they burned with red light, the kind that came from inside, not reflection. When he spoke, it was in perfect standard, deep, measured, but heavy enough to make the air tremble. "You mock my daughter," he said. "Then you mock me." Cale's blood turned to ice. The girl, Lyra, turned quickly, placing both hands on her father's chest. "Please no," she whispered in Karen tongue. He didn't mean it, but her father didn't even look at her. His gaze never left Cale. "I am General Tharos of the Karen Dominion," he said, "and no man insults my blood without standing to answer for it." Kyle rose slowly, trying to size him up. The soldier in him, the part that had once survived ambushes and alien front lines, began calculating distances, weight, speed, reach. He had a blaster, but somehow he knew that if he drew it, he'd be dead before his finger touched the trigger. "This is a misunderstanding," Kyle said, raising his hand slightly. "I was drunk. Tharos moved forward, and the sound of metal boots striking the floor echoed like thunder. "You were foolish," he interrupted. "You have two choices, human. Fight or beg." The room held its breath. Kyle felt the eyes of every patron burning into him. Warriors, traders, miners, even the ones who hated the Karen, knew better than to interfere. There was honor involved now, and no one would rob Tharos of it. Lyra tried again, stepping in front of her father. "He's just a stranger, father. Please, he's not worth it." Tharos's upper right hand gently moved her aside without effort. "A father's duty," he said softly, "is to teach respect, even if the lesson must be paid in blood." Kale's jaw tightened. He hated himself in that moment, hated that he'd become the kind of man who mocked others to quiet the ghosts in his own head. But he couldn't show it, not here. "Not now. Outside then," he said quietly. Tharos nodded once and turned toward the door. The crowd began to follow, a tide of whispers and anticipation. Fights were rare between species these days. Too many treaties, too much fear. But when it happened, no one missed it. Kyle stepped out into the night, the dry air burning his throat. Twin moons hung above the desert horizon, one red, one white, casting long, twisting shadows across the sand. The wind carried the faint hum of old machinery buried beneath the dunes, remnants of the last war. He flexed his fingers. They felt heavy. The door behind him opened, and Lyra slipped out, clutching his arm before he could walk forward. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "He doesn't want to kill you." "But he will if you don't yield." Kyle looked at her, truly looked this time. There was kindness in her face, even after what he'd said. That kindness cut deeper than any blade. "Why do you care?" he asked. "I insulted you." She hesitated, then whispered, "Because you looked like someone who's already lost too much." He didn't answer. Didn't know how to. Then Tharos's voice boomed from the open space ahead. "Come, human! Let your courage meet your consequence." Kale looked down at her one last time, gave a faint nod, and walked toward the ring of onlookers forming in the sand. The crowd parted like water before Tharos, who stood waiting, forearms bare, armor cast aside, eyes burning in the moonlight. Kyle could feel the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. Maybe he deserved this. Maybe it was time he stopped running from the man he'd become. He took one last deep breath, tasting dust and regret. The moons stretched his shadow beside Tharos's. Two warriors, one giant, one scarred, both haunted, and as he stepped into the circle, he realized something terrifying. He wasn't fighting for his life. He was fighting for his soul, and the night was just beginning. The desert air shimmered under the cold light of the twin moons, and the gathered crowd shifted in restless silence. The outpost lay behind them, its neon lights flickering weakly against the night. Out here, beyond the perimeter walls, the sand stretched like an ocean of bone, pale, rippling, endless. It was the perfect arena. No rules, no witnesses who mattered, and no one who would stop what was about to unfold. Tharos stood in the center, each of his four hands working in perfect harmony as he unlatched the armored plates from his body. The pieces fell into the sand with heavy metallic thuds. Beneath them, his skin was a deep iron gray, lined with faint scars that glowed faintly blue, the scars of old plasma wounds. His upper arms flexed, each one carrying a weapon shaped like a crescent blade, glowing with inner heat. The lower pair drew twin daggers, short but humming with silent power. The weapons made no sound except for a low hum that felt more like vibration in the bones than in the ears. Kyle swallowed hard. He was a soldier, a mercenary, a survivor of more wars than he could count. But this was different. He had fought men, machines, even beasts bred for slaughter, but never a legend. Tharos wasn't just a warrior. He was a living relic of the Karen Wars, a commander who'd led thousands, whose name was whispered in the archives of human fleets as both enemy and icon. Kyle took off his coat and tossed it aside, revealing the cybernetic lines that ran along his back and arms. They pulsed faintly blue as his systems activated. Tiny mechanical whirs clicked beneath his skin. His right arm, once flesh, was now an alloy of steel and muscle fiber, the result of a war that had taken more from him than just a limb. The crowd began to murmur in anticipation. A few placed quiet bets. Some muttered prayers. A duel like this, a human against a Karen general, wasn't just rare. It was suicidal. Tharos's voice cut through the air. "What is your name, human?" Gale straightened, dust swirling around his boots. "Gale, formerly of the 27th Drop Corps." Tharos's eyes narrowed, glowing like molten stone. "A soldier, then? Good. Perhaps your death will mean something." Kyle smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's just see who ends up dying." The words hung in the air like a spark, and then the spark became a storm. Tharos moved first. Despite his size, he was impossibly fast. The ground exploded under his feet as he closed the distance, his upper arms bringing the twin blades down in a flash of blue fire. Gale barely rolled aside in time, feeling the heat scorch the side of his face. The sand where he'd been standing turned black, glassed from the impact. Kyle came up swinging. His cybernetic arm caught the next strike, the metal shrieking as blade met alloy. Sparks flew, lighting up their faces in ghostly flashes. Tharos's lower arms lashed out, daggers cutting through the air. Kyle blocked one, ducked another, then kicked hard at Tharos's midsection. It was like kicking a wall. Tharos barely flinched. He responded with a backhand swing from one of his free arms, and the blow sent Kale tumbling across the sand. The crowd gasped, dust spiraling around him as he landed hard. "Stay down," Tharos rumbled, stepping forward. "You are not my equal," Kyle groaned, spitting blood into the sand. "Yeah, I've heard that before." He reached behind his belt and drew a small, curved blade, human-made, lightweight, its edge glinting under the moons. He lunged. The movement surprised Tharos, not because of speed, but because of intent. Kale wasn't trying to overpower him. He was aiming for balance, momentum, unpredictability. He slid low, carving a line across Tharos's leg armor. Sparks flared. Tharos growled, spinning and slamming a lower fist into Kale's chest. Kale staggered back, gasping, ribs screaming in pain. But he didn't fall. Tharos advanced, eyes narrowing. "You fight with desperation, not discipline." Kyle wiped blood from his lip. "You fight with pride, not mercy." The words made something flicker behind Tharos's expression. A shadow of memory, maybe even guilt. But it vanished as quickly as it came. He charged again. This time Kale didn't dodge. He met the attack head-on. Their weapons clashed in an explosion of light and sound. Plasma blades struck metal. Cybernetics hummed under strain. The crowd had stopped breathing entirely. The only sounds were the grind of steel and the distant hum of the desert wind. Each movement became slower, heavier. Sweat ran down Kyle's neck. Every time he blocked one strike, another came from a different direction. Tharos's forearms were an unrelenting storm, one arm striking high, another sweeping low, a third deflecting counterblows, a fourth readying the next attack before the last even landed. It was like fighting 4 men at once, all with the strength of gods. A blade grazed Kale's shoulder. The smell of burnt fabric filled the air. He retaliated with a feint, drew Tharos's attention with his right arm, then slammed his left knee into the general's side. The move connected, forcing Tharos back half a step. For the first time, the giant grunted. The crowd murmured, their disbelief rising. No one had ever made the general move backward. Kyle tried to press the advantage, slashing upward, but Tharos caught his wrist mid-swing. The grip tightened, crushing metal and flesh alike. Kyle cried out, pain ripping through his arm. "Enough," Tharos thundered. "You have proven courage." But courage does not erase insult. Kyle's knees hit the sand. He could feel his systems overloading. One more hit, and he'd be finished. Across the circle, Lyra stood frozen. Her hands were clasped over her mouth, tears glinting on her cheeks. She couldn't bear it anymore. "Father!" she shouted. Tharos didn't respond. His blades lifted high, glowing brighter with energy. "Father, stop!" she cried again, voice breaking. But it wasn't her words that stopped him. It was her tone, a sound so familiar, so heartbreakingly soft, that it reached into a place even war couldn't touch. Tharos froze. His blades trembled in his hands. Lyra stepped forward, her bare feet leaving prints in the sand. Her eyes, wide and shimmering, locked onto his. "He didn't mock me, father," she said. He mocked himself. Tharos turned his head slightly, still breathing hard. "What do you mean?" She knelt beside Kale, who was barely conscious, his breath shallow, his eyes unfocused. "Look at him," she said softly. "He's broken, not just in body and spirit. He carries pain like armor." The general's gaze flicked between them, the man bleeding at his feet, the daughter he'd sworn to protect. Lyra's voice trembled. "You see hatred, but I see mourning. He isn't laughing at me. He's laughing at the ghost of someone he couldn't save." Kale's lips moved, barely forming words. Don't speak for me." But his voice cracked under the weight of guilt he could no longer hide. Tharos's chest rose and fell slowly. The fury in his eyes dimmed to something else, something heavier, recognition. He lowered his upper arm slightly. The energy blades flickered, then extinguished. Around them, the crowd began whispering again, confused, disappointed, curious. The fight had paused, but its meaning had changed. Kyle struggled to rise, one knee pressing into the sand. His chest heaved. His words came out hoarse. "You think this was about honor, old man?" he rasped. "No, it was about me trying to feel something again." Tharos regarded him for a long, quiet moment. The moons reflected in his eyes like distant suns. Then he stepped back and said, voice low and thunderous, "If that is true, then this fight is no longer between us." The crowd stirred, uncertain of what he meant. Tharos dropped one of his swords into the sand. Then another. The sound of metal striking ground echoed through the night. He looked at Kale, gaze heavy but not cruel. "If you wish to fight, human," he said, "then fight not me. Fight the man who made you hollow." And as the desert wind rose around them, carrying away the last of the heat, Kale realized the duel had just shifted from survival to redemption. And redemption, he knew, would cost more than blood. The silence that followed was heavier than any blow either of them had struck. The crowd stood still beneath the twin moons, their faces pale in the blue light, their eyes darting between the two figures frozen in the sand. Tharos towered above Kale, his blades extinguished, his chest still heaving from the battle's rhythm. Kale was on his knees, one hand braced in the dirt, the other clutching his broken cybernetic arm. His breath came ragged, short, uneven. Every exhale painted the air with steam in the cold desert night. Tharos's words hung in the air like thunder, still echoing across the dunes. "If you wish to fight, human, then fight not me. Fight the man who made you hollow." It took Kale a moment to process them. Then another moment to lift his head. His face was smeared with blood and sand, his eyes half-lidded, but when he met the general's gaze, there was no more defiance in them, only exhaustion and something dangerously close to shame. "You think I haven't?" Kale rasped, his voice hoarse. "You think I don't fight him every damn day?" Tharos said nothing. His 4 hands hung loosely at his sides, but his presence still filled the arena. As if the very ground was waiting for his command, Kale laughed weakly, though it wasn't laughter so much as the sound of something breaking. "You talk about honor, about family? You're standing there with a daughter who looks at you like you're the stars themselves. You don't know what it's like to lose that." Lyra flinched at the words. She had remained where she was, standing halfway between the two men, her fingers pressed to her lips, a heart caught between duty and pity. Now, hearing the grief in Kale's tone, she stepped closer. "Who did you lose?" she asked softly. Kyle looked away. "Someone I couldn't protect," Tharos's voice rumbled low. "A comrade." Kyle shook his head slowly. "No." He hesitated, his throat tightening until the word barely escaped. "A daughter." The sound that rippled through the crowd wasn't surprise. It was something deeper. Even the mercenaries and smugglers who'd come for blood understood that word. It cut through language, through pride, through species. Tharos's expression changed. The anger in his eyes dimmed, replaced by something that looked like memory. "Tell me," he said quietly. Kyle didn't want to, but the fight had already stripped him bare. What was left to hide? He sat back in the sand, his breath shaking. She was different, he began. Half human, half something else. Skin a shade no one had seen on Earth, eyes too bright. The kind of beauty people don't understand, so they call it ugly. He swallowed, blinking hard. She used to ask me if she was a monster. Lyra's eyes welled. I told her no, that she was perfect, Kyle continued. But one day I was deployed, 3 systems away. Some kids in our colony. They thought it'd be funny to remind her she didn't belong. They cornered her near the docks. His voice cracked. By the time someone found her, she'd already jumped. The silence deepened. Even the wind seemed to stop for a moment. Tharos closed his eyes, his 4 hands curling into fists. His massive frame looked suddenly smaller, as if the weight of Kale's pain had reached across the space between them and settled on his shoulders too. Lyra knelt beside Kale, the blue glow of her skin faintly lighting his face. "And when you saw me," she whispered, "you saw her." Kyle nodded once. "Yeah," he gave a bitter smile. "Guess mocking you was easier than remembering her." Tharos opened his eyes. Their red glow softened. "And yet you chose cruelty over silence." Kale's laugh was quiet, bitter. "Because silence doesn't stop the ghosts. They follow you into every dream, every drink, every mirror. You start to think maybe if you become the thing they called her, cruel, heartless, broken, maybe it hurts less." Tharos was still for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, not the booming command of a general, but the weary tone of a father. "You wear your guilt like armor, human. But armor, too, can crush the one it's meant to protect." Kyle looked up at him, surprised. "You sound like a man who knows." Tharos's lower arms unclenched. "I do." He stepped forward, each foot sinking into the sand with a dull thud. "My first son died by my own order. I sent him to hold a line we could not hold. He followed my command as any soldier would. When I arrived, I found his body buried beneath the enemy dead, his blood spilled for my pride." He took a deep breath. "I swore never again to let pride lead me where mercy should go." The words hit Kale harder than any strike could have. The 2 men, human and alien, stood across from each other, mirrors of the same failure in different shapes. Lyra looked between them, her voice trembling. "Then maybe tonight isn't about victory," she said. "Maybe it's about forgiveness." Tharos's gaze softened as he looked at her. "You speak wisdom beyond your years, my daughter." Kyle shook his head weakly. "Forgiveness doesn't change what I did." Lyra turned to him. "No, but it changes what you become next." The wind began to rise again, swirling around them, carrying with it the dust of the desert and the murmurs of the crowd. Tharos reached to his belt and unhooked the last of his weapons. He walked forward slowly, the crowd parting like waves before him. Then in front of Kale he knelt, a giant humbling himself. He placed the plasma sword into Kale's hands. Kale stared, stunned. What are you doing?" Tharos looked up at him. "If you must fight," he said, "then fight the one enemy left, the one who has stolen your peace." Kyle stared at the blade. It was heavy, glowing faintly with blue fire, humming with ancient energy. His reflection shimmered in the metal, bloodied, hollow, tired. "I don't want to fight anymore," he whispered. Tharos nodded. "Then don't." Lyra reached out, touching the human's hand gently. "You can't undo the past, but you can stop letting it own you." Kyle's throat burned. The desert blurred around him as tears stung his eyes. He hadn't cried in years. Not since the day they buried a small, pale hand beneath a nameless stone on a forgotten colony world. He rose slowly, still holding the blade. The crowd's whispers died down as he looked at Tharos. "Then what happens now?" he asked quietly. Tharos stood as well, towering over him once more, but this time there was no threat in his height. "Now," he said, "you decide what kind of man your daughter would want you to be." Kale took a step back, staring at the sword. The glow reflected on his face, painting him in blue light. Slowly he turned it downward, pressing the edge against his cybernetic arm. The hum grew louder. "What are you doing?" Lyra whispered. Kale's voice was soft but steady. "Letting go." With one sharp motion, he drove the blade through his mechanical arm. Sparks burst, lighting up the sand like falling stars. He didn't cry out. He just let the ruined metal fall to the ground with a dull clang. Smoke curled from the stump, glowing faintly where flesh met wire. Tharos took a step forward, his expression unreadable. "You would wound yourself for penance?" Kyle nodded weakly. "It's the only thing I know how to do." Tharos looked at him for a long moment, then reached out one of his massive hands and rested it on the man's shoulder. His voice was low, reverent. "Then let this wound be your last." Lyra knelt beside them both, her eyes shimmering in the pale moonlight. The crowd, once hungry for spectacle, was silent now, not out of fear but respect. In that moment, the line between victor and vanquished vanished. There were only 3 souls standing in the sand, one who had lost, one who had nearly lost, and one who refused to let loss define them. Tharos looked to the horizon, where the dunes bled into shadow. "The night is ending," he said quietly. "Leave your ghosts here, Kyle. Let the desert keep them." Kyle followed his gaze, and for the first time in years, the weight on his chest lifted, not completely, but enough to let him breathe. The crowd began to disperse, whispering about what they'd witnessed, a battle that ended not in death, but in understanding. Lyra offered her hand. "Come, my father's camp is open to you." Kyle hesitated, then took it. Her skin was cool, her touch steady, and as they walked toward the lights of the outpost, the sand behind them bore no marks of blood, only footprints slowly fading beneath the wind. Kyle didn't look back. For once he didn't have to. The moons were beginning to sink behind the dunes, their twin lights fading into a pale gold glow that spilled softly across the desert. The wind had grown colder, carrying with it the dry scent of dust and iron. The crowd had already begun to disperse, their voices low, uncertain, as though speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile truce had settled over the battlefield. Only 3 figures remained, the human, the warrior, and the daughter whose presence had turned rage into revelation. Kyle stood still, his breathing uneven, his mechanical arm severed, the faint hiss of cooling metal mingling with the sigh of the wind. The plasma blade still glowed faintly at his feet, its energy fading like a dying heartbeat. Around him, the sand bore the marks of their struggle, deep grooves, scattered glass from scorched grains, and patches darkened by blood. But where he stood now, there was quiet. For the first time in years, there was quiet. Tharos regarded him from a few paces away, 4 arms folded, eyes no longer burning with fury, but calm, reflective. The general's voice came low, almost gentle. "You've carried your war for too long, human. Sometimes the hardest victory is putting down your weapon." Kale looked up at him, exhausted but strangely clear-eyed. "I tried that once," he said. "Didn't work." "The ghosts followed anyway." Tharos gave a slow nod, as though he understood more than Kale expected. "They always do," he said. "But the ghosts only win if we stop walking." Lyra moved between them, her bare feet sinking softly into the cooling sand. The wind tugged at the silver fabric of her clothes, making them shimmer like starlight. She looked at Kyle with quiet compassion, the kind of gaze that didn't pity him, only saw him for what he was, wounded, but not beyond repair. "You've punished yourself long enough," she said. "But your daughter wouldn't want you to end here. She'd want you to live differently. For her." Kyle blinked, her words cutting deeper than any blade could. "You sound so sure of that." "I am," Lyra said softly. "Because I am someone's daughter too." The simplicity of it broke him. The tightness in his chest finally gave way, and the tears came, silent and unrestrained. He dropped to his knees, head bowed, his shoulders shaking as the weight of years poured out in soundless sobs. The pain that had calcified in him, layer by layer, cracked apart under the weight of kindness, a force he had forgotten could exist. Tharos stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over Kale. Then, to the shock of everyone still lingering at the edge of the dunes, the great 4-armed general bent down on one knee before the human. His upper hands rested on his knees, but his lower ones reached forward and rested lightly on Kyle's shoulder. Not in dominance, not in pity, but in shared grief. "Your pain does not dishonor you," Tharos said quietly. "It means your heart still remembers how to feel." That is not weakness, Kyle of the 27th Corps. That is strength. Kyle looked up slowly, his voice trembling. Strength. I've been running from pain my entire life. I let it rot me from the inside. I turned it into anger, and all it ever did was make me more like the men who hurt her. Tharos nodded, his expression unreadable. Then stop running. Stand where it began, and choose something else. Kyle stared at the sand, at the black glass marks where plasma had kissed the ground. Choose what? Tharos stood to his full height again, the first light of dawn painting his armor in pale gold. Life, he said simply. The word seemed too small for its weight, but it settled into Kale like an anchor. Life, the one thing he'd forgotten he was still capable of. Lyra extended her hand again. Her voice was soft but steady. Come with us, she said. You need a place to start over. And my father's camp has room for those who wish to be more than what they were. Kyle hesitated. He looked at the hand, slender, blue-skinned, glowing faintly in the rising light, and then at Tharos. You're offering me. What, forgiveness? Tharos shook his head. No, I'm offering you purpose. Kyle's brow furrowed. Purpose? The general gestured toward his daughter. You mocked her once. Now you will protect her. You will learn the honor you forgot, and she will learn the courage you carry. That is the way of balance. Kyle's mouth opened, then closed again. For a moment he almost laughed. You're trusting me to guard your daughter? After what I said. Tharos's expression didn't change. I trust the man who bled to destroy his own hatred more than one who hides behind his pride. Lyra smiled faintly. Besides, she added softly, you could use someone to remind you when you're being foolish. Kyle looked between them, his throat tightening. He had never felt more unworthy nor more seen. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said quietly. But I can't promise I'll be any good at it. Tharos's eyes glinted faintly with something that might have been humor. No one ever is at first. The wind shifted again, this time carrying with it the faintest scent of rain. Impossible in a desert like this, yet unmistakable. Kyle turned his face toward it, eyes closing, as if the world itself had exhaled. When he opened them again, the horizon was glowing, thin lines of orange and gold spreading like fire through the dunes. The war between night and day was ending, and for once, Kyle found himself on the side of light. They began to walk, 3 figures moving toward the outpost, their shadows stretching long across the sand. Each step hurt, but it was a clean pain, the kind that comes with healing rather than harm. As they neared the walls, Kyle looked back one last time. The arena was empty now, the marks of battle slowly erased by the wind. The desert kept no memory, no judgment. It took everything and left only silence. He turned back toward the camp where faint fires were starting to burn and asked quietly, So, what happens when your people find out you've taken in a human who insulted your family? Tharos's deep voice rumbled behind him, steady and certain. Then they will see that mercy is the weapon of kings, Lyra added, smiling. And if they don't, Father will simply challenge them too. That made Kale chuckle, the first real laugh he'd had in years. It startled him how natural it felt, how it didn't sound bitter this time. They reached the camp as the sun rose, painting the tents and banners in bronze light. Garen's soldiers stopped and stared as the human entered beside their general and his daughter. Some frowned, others whispered, but none dared question Tharos's command. Tharos turned to Kale once more before they entered. You came to this world seeking escape, he said. Instead you found a mirror. You may never erase your sins, but you can ensure they end with you. Kyle nodded, his voice quiet. Then maybe that's enough. Lyra smiled and walked ahead of them, her figure outlined in gold. Kyle followed, feeling the warmth of the rising sun touch his face, chasing away the cold that had lived there too long. Behind them, the desert wind whispered through the dunes, not in anger, but in peace. The place that had almost been his grave was now his beginning, and as he crossed into the camp beside the 4-armed warrior and his daughter, Kyle finally understood what the fight had truly been about. It had never been about honor or vengeance. or proving who was stronger. It had been about forgiveness, the kind that demands not victory, but surrender. Because some battles aren't meant to be won at all. They're meant to be survived so that life, fragile, stubborn life, can go on. And somewhere deep inside, in a place long sealed off by guilt, Cale could almost hear a small, familiar voice whisper through the wind. "You did protect me. Dad, you finally did." The words faded with the dawn, leaving only silence and a man who was at last ready to live.